The kerosene lantern is spluttering, sending blobs of darkness radiating into the night, and I sit barricaded in my one-room barsati, holding hands over my ears to block the sounds of the riots outside. The whole of Matsyapur is aflame tonight. The smoke-laden air hovering above the town is irradiated by 1,000 burning homes, but here I sit in darkness. As the minutes turn to hours and as the first violent clashes abate, I can do any of these following, right? I turn the lantern wick and make it brighter. I peer outside through a crack in the window, or the other one. Another flicker in the darkness will not be noticed, I say to myself after turning the lantern wick. As the flame dances away the gloom, I peer at my old pocket watch. It has been 7 hours and 11 minutes since the first wail of the curfew hours mingled with the agonized cries of someone having their limbs torn apart. 7 hours and 11 minutes spent crouching in abject terror. And despite the horror outside my thin brick wall, I cannot help but laugh. Laugh at the sheer relief of being alive. There is a sudden knock at the door. "Let me in, open the door, I know you are in there," shouts a muffled voice, and a spout of fear erupts in my belly, my laughter dying on my lips. I shutter the lantern immediately, or maybe I rush to the window to escape, or I shout, "Who is it? What do you want?" Regardless of what I do, you are here, I am here. It is happening to us. A story which existed in the past and was merely a record has now become an enactment, something to be performed by the agency of choice, and that is what I want to speak of today. I want to speak of stories, of history, and I want to speak of games. Because if we were to write our history within games, it would create a very plural, empathetic, and generous record of our lives. If history is the mere recollection of past, a narrative of the past, then stories are its vocabulary. And it is by telling stories that we gain autonomy over our lived experiences, that we mythologize our reality, that we start to understand how narratives can start to affect real life. And it is with great horror that I confront the colonial legacy of the void of stories that it has created. And all my work in creating interactive fiction is a very small attempt at trying to bridge this gap and trying to fill this void. Beginning in 15th century AD, there began a period of tremendous pillage of a very large part of the world, animated by ideas of rational and categorical record, a period we call the colonial age. And during the colonial age, there was an unprecedented movement of slaves and labor, of animals and foliage, of material and mineral goods and produce. And along with it, there was a dislocation of images, ideas, and ultimately stories. The lived history of people was fragmented, broken, apportioned, and bartered. It was exotified and aggrandized by imperial powers, and in the form of figurines, sculpture, portraits, landscape, apocrypha, travelogues, it found itself piece by unrelated piece being carried into Europe to be used as embellishments to demonstrate the authority of the imperial race or European races that were at that time ruling over very large sections of the world. Now, the further such particles of history are made to travel from their material source, the more absurd they become, the more ridiculous they become. And often they are used to cement ideas of racial inequity and violence that have perpetuated till date. A very good example of this is Albrecht Dürer's woodcut of a rhinoceros, the one on the screen that you see here. In 1515, the Maharaja of Cambath, or Cambay, sent a rhinoceros as a gift to the King of Portugal, and the creature was displayed in Lisbon in a menagerie for a while, and then it died while being shipped to Rome. Now, Albrecht Dürer, a Renaissance theorist and artist, who had never seen the rhinoceros in person, nonetheless drew a fantastical and anatomically inaccurate version of the creature, which became the prevailing European vision of what a rhinoceros is for the next nearly 200 years, endlessly repeated in their encyclopedias and repositories. And sometimes, when disparate cultures collide, you will have, amidst their mutual bewilderment, benign pieces of history being exchanged, but oftentimes it creates a toxic and conflict-ridden understanding of history and the lived experience of people living there. Take, for example, the paintings of Jean Gérôme, a French Orientalist who painted indolent pashas and fantastical marketplaces and harems without ever having traveled to the Orient. And despite the beauty inherent in each frame, it is equally decadent because they were all used as justifications for why the European races at that time were chosen to bring their civilization to the uncouth savages they were ruling over. And a version of this can be found in Rudyard Kipling's poem as well, White Man's Burden, where he very alarmingly says of people like us, the colonial races, calling us half devils and half child. Now, in the presence of nationalistic fervor or colonial authority or any such overwhelming privilege, I believe that it withdraws from us our ability to tell our own stories and tell our own histories, and that certain stories and certain histories will simply not be told because the violence of their recollection and the absurdity of their form is not embedded in the method of their telling. Now, a lot of people have worked long and hard, especially in the post-colonial disciplines, to try and bring narratives from fissures of race and gender to the fore and give them political voice again. Take Dalit movements in India, for example. They have been embattled for simply trying to take a small amount of subaltern voice and give it social and political authority. And any such decolonization process has to deal with the hegemonies of certain institutions, nations, and records, and all the certainty that they breed. And what we are trying to do is challenge that certainty, challenge that fulcrum of power by introducing a small dislocation of our own. We propose that we tell our histories through play, because games are a delightful and democratic medium. They can tell fragmented, broken, discordant, interjected stories and still create something comprehensible out of them. And when I speak of games, I mean video games, of course, but I also mean physical games, performative play, certain kinds of storytelling, certain kinds of theater, some toys as well. Most of all, what I mean is for a player to be able to exhibit intent within a story. What I mean is for a player to feel safe that their actions within the ambit of the game, within the simulation, will not cause lasting material change to the world around them, so that they are free to falter and ignore the conventions of society while they play. And this makes games very, very good at connecting extremely disparate pieces of information together. It is, after all, no accident that most of the internet, which is disparate pieces of data, is connected together using a very primitive form of interactive fiction, the hyperlink, the node, the clickable text. And it lets you author your own journey through the narrative of the data that you're searching for without having to rely on somebody else ordering it. And for the very first time in a millennia of telling stories, there is room between the writing of a story and its enactment. There is an interlocutor between a player, a user, if you will. And in any form of interactive fiction, the player is always part author. The storyteller is the author, the narrator is the author, the audience is the author, and the player embodies all these roles, and sometimes also the role of the actor who is being role-played within the game. Now, if an argument has to be made inside a piece of interactive fiction or a game, the structure of the argument has to map onto the logic of the game. And the logic of the game has to be open for the player to probe and explore, even as they are being told the story. But in doing all of this, games are not doing anything that is surprising or new. They are beholden to older traditions of folk theater. Now, folk theater is a very vague and general term, and it continues across a variety of practices, but for our purposes, it will be enough to call it folk theater. Folk theater adds between the writing of a play and its enactment either actors or narrators, and the adding of an interlocutor that way allows you to provoke and challenge the very thesis of a play. The role of a sutradhar, the holder of threads, or a narrator, is precisely this. They can often eclipse the author in how they restructure the performance of a folk play or a street play to try and address local concerns, material concerns, vernacular issues in the improvisational style that these plays are otherwise conducted in. And what I argue is that video games especially, but many other kinds of interactive fiction, are a direct derivation of this form of storytelling. They are very similar to Bhawais, they are very similar to Notankis, to temple courtyard storytellers, and to troubadours, and all of them collectively are engaged in the process of mythologizing our history. And I would argue that both these traditions are similar because they start by withdrawing the author from the telling of the story and by replacing her with an ever-changing Sutradhar in the form of a player. And the critical countercultural role that folk theatre has always played in our culture can now safely be apportioned to video games or to other forms of interactive fiction. And this makes video games ideally suited to tell contested and violent stories from fissures of history, from local and vernacular sources in a surprising and sympathetic manner. Thank you.